The crisp Saturday morning air hung heavy with the scent of pine trees and freshly cut grass as Pittsburgh's Frick Park came alive with children's laughter. Among the carefree families, a black luxury SUV with tinted windows pulled to a discreet stop, drawing curious glances from nearby nannies pushing expensive strollers. Richard Castellini stepped out, his tailored suit contrasting sharply with the casual weekend attire of other parents. His presence commanded respect, without a single word spoken, eyes scanning the perimeter before allowing his 4-year-old daughter Penny to scramble down from her car seat. "Daddy, can I go to the swings?" Penny asked, her bright eyes sparkling with childish excitement, a stark contrast to the cold calculation that typically dominated her father's gaze. The man who controlled Pittsburgh's underworld with an iron fist seemed to soften visibly around his daughter, the last living connection to his beloved late wife. "Stay where I can see you, princess," Richard instructed, his deep voice gentle only for her ears. He watched her skip toward the playground, golden curls bouncing in the sunlight, as his bodyguards positioned themselves at strategic points around the park's perimeter. Richard settled on a bench, maintaining the careful distance that separated him from ordinary civilians, his phone constantly buzzing with business that couldn't wait even on a Saturday morning. The Empire never slept, and neither did the responsibilities that came with being the most feared man in western Pennsylvania. Penny's delighted squeal drew his attention away from a particularly troubling message about shipments at the docks. She had abandoned the swings and was now chatting animatedly with a young woman sitting alone on the edge of the playground, her simple dress and worn shoes marking her as someone from a different world entirely. Something in the woman's posture, a quiet dignity despite obvious financial struggles, caused Richard to rise from his bench, a strange unease settling in his chest. Before he could signal his men, Penny was already pulling the blonde stranger by the hand toward him, bubbling with excitement. "Daddy, this is Miss Heather. She knows Mommy," Penny announced, unaware of how her innocent words sent a chill down her father's spine. Richard's entire body tensed as he assessed the slender woman standing before him, her clear blue-gray eyes meeting his without a trace of fear. "Mr. Castellini," she said softly, recognition flashing across her features as she took an instinctive step backward. "I didn't realize who she was until she mentioned her mother's name. I used to be your wife's nurse during her final days at Mercy Hospital." Richard felt the world tilt slightly beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes as memories flooded back. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room, the constant beeping of machines, and his wife's fading voice. "Security check," he murmured into his cuff, watching as his men immediately closed ranks around them. "I don't want trouble," Heather said quickly, her eyes darting to the approaching men in dark suits. "Your daughter approached me, and I simply recognized her from Catherine's photos. She has her mother's smile." The mention of his wife's name from this stranger's lips made Richard's jaw clench tight enough to crack teeth. He studied the woman's face, searching for deception, but finding only a nervous sincerity that somehow penetrated the armor he'd built around himself since Catherine's death. "Miss Heather told me she used to read stories to Mommy when she was sick," Penny interjected, swinging the woman's hand back and forth, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. "She knows the penguin story Mommy used to tell me." Richard motioned for his head of security to stand down, his mind racing through possibilities and threats. "How long did you work with my wife?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled, despite the hurricane of emotions threatening to break free beneath his composed exterior. 6 months on the oncology floor," Heather replied, her gaze steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I was there until the end, until she asked me to deliver something to you. But when I came to your house afterward, your security wouldn't let me near you." Richard's world narrowed to this woman's face, the park around them fading to background noise as his heart hammered against his ribs. "What did she ask you to deliver?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that would have sent his business rivals scrambling for cover. "Not here," Heather replied, glancing meaningfully at Penny, who was now crouching to examine a ladybug crawling across the pavement. "It's been 2 years, and I've tried contacting you through proper channels. Your people always blocked me." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees overhead, carrying memories of another October, when Catherine had first received her diagnosis. Richard considered the woman before him, plainly dressed but with an unmistakable strength in her posture that reminded him painfully of his late wife. "Daddy, can Miss Heather come have ice cream with us?" Penny asked, tugging at Richard's hand and shattering the tense moment. "She told me she liked strawberry just like Mommy did." Richard studied Heather's face once more, noting the slight shadows beneath her eyes and the worn edges of her cardigan. "My driver will take you to Riverside Cafe in 1 hour." he stated, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request but a command. "I have a shift at the diner in 2 hours," Heather responded, surprising him with her directness. "I can meet you there in 30 minutes, but I won't get into a car with your men. I'm not that trusting, Mr. Castellini." A surprised smile, the first genuine one in months, threatened to crack Richard's carefully maintained facade. Few people dared to negotiate with him, and even fewer survived the experience. 30 minutes at Riverside. Phil will watch you until then. As Heather walked away, Richard noticed the slight limp in her gait and the careful way she navigated the park path. "Run a complete background check," he muttered to his second-in-command. "I want to know everything about her by the time we sit down for coffee." Back in the SUV, Penny chattered excitedly about her new friend while Richard stared out the window, memories washing over him like a relentless tide. Catherine's final weeks had been a blur of specialists, experimental treatments, and eventually, the quiet acceptance that had broken something fundamental inside him. "Daddy, you look sad," Penny observed, her small hand patting his much larger one with the innocent compassion that both healed and wounded him. "Miss Heather said Mommy was very brave. Was she brave like the princesses in my stories?" Richard gathered his daughter into his arms, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Your mother was braver than any princess," he whispered, allowing himself a rare moment of vulnerability as they drove through Pittsburgh's autumn-painted streets. Through the tinted windows, Richard observed the city he controlled, the businesses that paid for protection, the politicians who looked the other way, the empire built through calculated violence and strategic alliances. None of it had saved Catherine from the cancer that claimed her life. "Sir, we have preliminary information on Heather Bennett," his security chief announced from the front seat. "Former oncology nurse at Mercy Hospital, left shortly after Mrs. Castellini's passing. Currently works 2 jobs, morning shifts at Steel City Diner and evenings at a nursing home in Bloomfield." Richard digested this information, feeling the first stirrings of curiosity replacing his initial suspicion. "Financial status?" he asked, already suspecting the answer from her worn clothing and the careful way she'd mentioned her upcoming shift. "Significant medical debt of her own," came the reply. "Monthly treatments for chronic condition. Rheumatoid arthritis diagnosed 3 years ago. Lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in Lawrenceville. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket." The Riverside Cafe sat nestled against the Allegheny River, its outdoor patio offering breathtaking views of Pittsburgh's skyline and enough privacy for conversations that shouldn't reach curious ears. Richard arrived precisely on time, having left Penny with her nanny after extracting a promise not to mention their new acquaintance to anyone. Heather was already seated at a corner table, her back to the wall with clear sightlines to all entrances, a choice that spoke of someone more aware of their surroundings than the average civilian. She wore the same simple outfit from the park, her blonde hair now pulled back into a practical ponytail. "You've got 3 of your men watching us right now," she noted without preamble as Richard took the seat across from her. "One by the entrance, one pretending to read near the river, and one who followed me from the park. Overkill for a conversation with a nurse, don't you think?" Richard signaled the hovering waiter with a slight nod, waiting until 2 coffees were delivered, and the staff retreated beyond earshot. "In my position, caution isn't overkill. It's survival. Now tell me what my wife wanted you to deliver." Heather's slender fingers wrapped around her coffee cup, drawing strength from its warmth. "During her last week, when you were dealing with that situation in Cleveland, Catherine gave me a sealed envelope and made me promise to deliver it personally to you after she was gone." The mention of Cleveland sent ice through Richard's veins. The bloody territory dispute that had pulled him away during Catherine's final days remained his deepest regret. "Why didn't you mail it? Why try to see me in person?" "Because she made me promise to see your face when you received it," Heather replied, her gaze unflinching despite the intimidating presence of the man across from her. "She said some things can't be trusted to postal services or intermediaries, especially in your line of work." Richard's expression remained impassive, though inwardly he admired the woman's courage. "And what exactly do you know about my line of work, Miss Bennett?" he asked, his tone conversational despite the dangerous undercurrent. "I know enough to be careful," she answered simply, placing her coffee down with steady hands. "I worked hospice care before oncology. You learn to read people quickly in that job, to see past facades and understand what lies beneath." A strange feeling of exposure washed over Richard, as if this woman could somehow see through the armor he'd constructed over years of climbing Pittsburgh's criminal hierarchy. "So what happened to this envelope after my security turned you away?" "I kept it safe," Heather said, reaching slowly into her bag and withdrawing a cream-colored envelope, the edges slightly worn from handling but the seal still unbroken. I tried several times to deliver it, but after the third attempt and an implicit threat from your men, I decided to wait for fate to intervene. Richard stared at the envelope now resting on the table between them, Catherine's elegant handwriting spelling his name across the front. And you never opened it? Never grew curious enough to peek at my wife's final words? Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed, Heather responded, a flash of genuine offense crossing her features. Catherine trusted me. In my profession, trust is sacred, especially the trust of someone facing their final moments. Richard's fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for the envelope, a reaction no business rival had ever witnessed. The paper felt impossibly heavy in his hands, carrying the weight of words his wife had intended him to read 2 years ago. Would you like privacy? Heather asked, already rising from her chair, demonstrating a compassion rarely shown in Richard's world of power plays and ulterior motives. Her understanding of the moment's gravity touched something long dormant in his chest. With a quick shake of his head, Richard broke the seal and unfolded a single page covered in Catherine's distinctive handwriting. The first words, "My dearest Richard, if you're reading this, I've finally convinced someone to breach your fortress," brought a painful constriction to his throat. As his eyes moved across the page, Richard's carefully constructed world began to crumble around him. Catherine described discoveries she'd made about his business partner, Paul Harrington, during her final months, financial documents accidentally delivered to their home, whispered phone conversations overhead during Paul's hospital visits. She knew, Richard whispered, looking up at Heather with new understanding dawning in his eyes. She discovered Paul was embezzling from our legitimate businesses and making deals with the Cortese family behind my back. Heather nodded solemnly, finally sitting back down. She found out when one of her specialists mentioned seeing Paul meeting with known Cortese associates at a restaurant in Philadelphia. She was worried it would put you and Penny in danger. The letter continued with detailed locations of evidence Catherine had gathered and hidden away, flash drives tucked into hollowed-out books in their library, account numbers written in invisible ink on the backs of family photographs, recordings saved under innocent file names on her personal laptop. "There's more," Heather said softly, reaching back into her bag and extracting a small silver flash drive. "This contains medical records that were altered after Catherine's death. Her oncologist, Dr. Marshall, had connections to the Cortese family too." Richard's mind raced through implications, making connections Catherine had already mapped out for him in her letter. "They accelerated her treatments, pushed for more aggressive options when she was already too weak," he said, the truth crystallizing with devastating clarity. "I noticed inconsistencies in her charts," Heather confirmed, her professional demeanor momentarily overtaken by old anger. "Medication dosages that didn't match orders, treatment schedules that contradicted standard protocols. When I raised concerns, I was transferred to another floor." Richard carefully refolded the letter, his grief transforming into something cold and focused, as pieces of a puzzle 2 years in the making finally aligned. They wanted her gone because she knew too much. They used her illness as cover. Catherine suspected as much, Heather replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's why she made me promise to get this to you personally. She was afraid the wrong people would intercept it, afraid you might not believe it from anyone else." The cafe's ambient noise faded as Richard processed this revelation. Every business decision and strange coincidence since Catherine's death now cast in a sinister new light. "Why did you wait so long? 2 years have passed." "I tried for 6 months," Heather answered, defensive heat coloring her words. "Your security chief, Sanders, threatened to have me arrested for harassment. Then my arthritis diagnosis came, and survival became my priority." Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming message, the screen displaying an alert about unusual activity at his downtown office. "Paul's making his move," he murmured, pieces clicking together with terrifying speed. "He must have seen us together and panicked." 2 days later, Heather stood nervously at the wrought iron gates of the Castellini estate, an imposing Georgian mansion nestled in Pittsburgh's exclusive Shadyside neighborhood. The formal invitation delivered to her apartment had seemed surreal, an elaborate card requesting her presence for Sunday dinner, signed by Richard himself. "Miss Bennett," greeted the security guard who opened the passenger door for her after thoroughly checking the taxi that had delivered her. "Mr. Castellini is expecting you. Please follow me to the main house." The manicured grounds stretched before her in autumn splendor, maple trees blazing with red and gold leaves against the backdrop of the stone mansion. Heather felt painfully out of place in her simple blue dress, the nicest thing she owned, as she approached the entrance where Richard waited. "Thank you for coming," he said formally, though something warmer than their previous encounter flickered in his eyes. "Penny hasn't stopped talking about you since the park. She'll be delighted you accepted our invitation." The interior of the mansion revealed tasteful luxury, hardwood floors, original artwork, and family photographs artfully arranged to create the impression of a normal, albeit wealthy, household. No evidence of Richard's actual business empire was visible in this carefully curated space. "Miss Heather," squealed Penny, racing down the grand staircase in a pink dress with a stuffed penguin clutched to her chest. "Daddy said you were coming. Did you bring the special book you told me about?" Heather smiled genuinely, kneeling to the child's level despite the protest from her joints. "I did bring it. Your mom's favorite poetry book that I used to read to her. Would you like to see it after dinner?" As they moved to the dining room, Heather noticed subtle security measures throughout the house, strategically placed cameras, reinforced windows, and staff members who carried themselves with the alertness of trained professionals rather than household help. "I've made some discoveries since our meeting," Richard said once Penny had been temporarily distracted by the housekeeper bringing in appetizers. "You were right about Dr. Marshall. He disappeared yesterday, emptied his bank accounts, and abandoned his practice without notice." Heather absorbed this information with a small nod, unsurprised by the doctor's flight. Catherine always said he seemed nervous during their final appointments, checking his phone constantly, rushing through examinations that should have been thorough. "Paul hasn't shown his face at the office either," Richard continued, his voice conversational despite the lethal intent Heather could sense beneath his words. "But I've frozen all accounts he had access to, and recovered most of Catherine's evidence exactly where she said it would be." The dinner progressed with surprising normalcy. A delicious meal served on fine china, Penny's childish chatter filling silences, and occasional reminiscences about Catherine that brought both pain and comfort to the unlikely dinner companions. "Would you read to me from Mommy's book now?" Penny asked as dessert was cleared away, her innocent request bridging the vastly different worlds of the two adults at the table. "Daddy says you did special voices just like Mommy did." In the mansion's library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the lingering scent of Catherine's favorite lavender candles, Heather opened the worn poetry book to a dog-eared page. "This was the poem your mother asked for most often during our quiet evenings at the hospital." Richard leaned against the doorframe, watching as his daughter curled trustingly against this stranger, who somehow carried pieces of Catherine's final days that he had been denied. The sight awakened conflicting emotions: gratitude, jealousy, and something more complex he wasn't ready to name. "You've taken a significant risk by coming here," Richard said later, after Penny had been tucked into bed with promises of another visit from Heather soon. "Paul has connections throughout the city. If he's realized you're the missing link to Catherine's evidence, you're in danger." Heather met his gaze steadily, the warm library light softening her features. "I've lived with this risk for 2 years, Mr. Castellini. Every time I tried to reach you, I knew I was potentially exposing myself. Catherine's truth was worth that risk." The first attempt came 3 days later, a car that accelerated suddenly as Heather crossed the street from the diner after her morning shift. Only the quick reaction of Richard's man, positioned discreetly across the street, saved her from becoming another Pittsburgh traffic statistic. "You can't go back to your apartment," Richard insisted that evening, pacing the safe house he'd arranged in a quiet neighborhood on the city's outskirts. "Paul's desperate. He knows what we've found, and he's trying to eliminate loose ends." Heather sat at the kitchen table, arms wrapped around herself as the reality of her situation finally registered. "I have patients at the nursing home counting on me. I can't just disappear without explanation. Many of them have already lost too many people." Richard paused his pacing, struck by her concern for others despite the threat to her own life. "I'll have Sanders arrange temporary coverage, a family emergency requiring your immediate attention. Your job will be waiting when this is over." The safe house was modest but comfortable, a far cry from Richard's mansion, but several steps above Heather's apartment in Lawrenceville. Fresh flowers stood in vases throughout the rooms, a thoughtful touch that didn't escape Heather's notice. "We've connected Paul to offshore accounts holding over $30 million in embezzled funds," Richard explained, pouring them both glasses of wine as night fell outside the secured windows. "But the evidence linking him directly to Catherine's medical treatment remains circumstantial." Heather accepted the glass, their fingers brushing momentarily in a contact that sent unexpected warmth through her tired body. "The altered medical records on the flash drive should help, especially if we can locate Dr. Marshall and convince him to testify." "My sources suggest Marshall fled to Canada," Richard replied, settling into the chair opposite her with uncharacteristic weariness. But he left behind a trail of communications with Paul dating back 3 years, encrypted, but my tech team is making progress. As days passed in the safe house, an unexpected routine developed. Richard arriving each evening with updates on the investigation and dinner from Pittsburgh's finest restaurants, Penny visiting on weekends with books and drawings, and Heather gradually sharing stories of Catherine's final months that brought both pain and healing. She never lost her spirit, Heather recounted one evening, as they sat before the fireplace, autumn rain pattering against the windows. Even on her worst days, she insisted on wearing her favorite silk scarves and red lipstick, said no disease would rob her of her dignity. Richard smiled at this detail, so perfectly Catherine that it made his chest ache with renewed loss. She wore red lipstick on our first date, said a woman should always make a statement. I knew that night I would never meet anyone like her again. The unspoken weight of those words hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of a connection neither was ready to name. She worried about you and Penny, Heather said softly, redirecting the conversation to safer ground. She made me promise to check that you were really living, not just existing. 1 month into Heather's protective custody, Richard arrived at the safe house with tension radiating from every line of his body. We've been betrayed from within, he announced without preamble, tossing a file onto the coffee table. Sanders has been working with Paul for years. Heather leaned forward, examining photographs of Richard's security chief, meeting with known Cortese associates at a remote cabin outside the city. Is this why your men were so determined to keep me away from you after Catherine's death? Sanders was blocking Catherine's message. Not just blocking it, actively working to ensure Paul's plan succeeded, Richard confirmed, his voice deadly calm despite the rage Heather could see simmering beneath the surface. He's been feeding information about our investigation to Paul for weeks. That night, Richard moved Heather to a new location, a converted warehouse in Pittsburgh's Strip District that served as one of his organization's most secure facilities. The industrial exterior belied the surprisingly comfortable apartment hidden within its concrete walls. No one knows about this place except my most trusted Lieutenant Frank, Richard explained, guiding Heather through security measures that would have impressed military contractors. Not even Penny has been here. It's my final fallback position. The realization that Richard had brought her to his most private sanctuary wasn't lost on Heather, who set her small bag of belongings beside a leather couch that probably cost more than her yearly salary. You're putting a lot of faith in someone you barely know. Catherine trusted you with her final message and our daughter's safety, Richard replied simply, his usual armor of detachment slipping to reveal something vulnerable beneath. In my world, that means more than years of acquaintance. Morning light filtered through bulletproof windows, casting warm patterns across the polished concrete floors as Heather awoke to the unfamiliar sounds of the warehouse district coming to life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee guided her to the kitchen where Richard stood studying documents spread across a steel countertop. We've located Marshall in Toronto, he announced without looking up, though Heather noticed how his posture shifted subtly at her presence. Frank's team is preparing to extract him, voluntarily if possible, but we'll get him regardless. Heather poured herself coffee from an elaborate machine that required 3 attempts to operate correctly. If Sanders was compromised, how can you be sure about Frank? She asked, the question born of genuine concern rather than accusation. Richard finally looked up, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept at all. Frank was Catherine's cousin, the only family member who stood by her when she married me. His loyalty isn't to my business, it's to our family. Days blended into a strange routine as Heather and Richard worked together to compile evidence against Paul and his network. Her medical expertise proved invaluable in decoding treatment irregularities buried in Catherine's records, while Richard's resources provided access to financial trails that ordinary law enforcement would never uncover. You never asked what kind of business I actually run, Richard observed one evening as they shared takeout from a nearby Thai restaurant. Most people make assumptions based on rumors and newspaper headlines. Heather set down her chopsticks, considering her words carefully. Catherine told me enough to understand the complexity of your position. She said your legitimate businesses employed hundreds of Pittsburgh families who would otherwise struggle. The warehouse fell silent, except for distant street sounds filtering through reinforced walls. And the illegitimate ones? Richard asked, a challenge in his voice that suggested her answer mattered more than she might realize. Those were never my concern, Heather replied honestly, meeting his gaze without flinching. I'm a nurse. I've treated gunshot victims and overdoses without asking how they happened. My job is healing, not judgment. Richard's laugh, the first genuine one she'd heard from him, filled the space between them with unexpected warmth. Catherine said almost exactly the same thing the night I told her the truth about my family business. She had a healer's heart, too. On the 7th night in the warehouse, Penny arrived with Frank for a surprise visit, bringing homemade cookies and a hand-drawn picture depicting 3 stick figures, one tall with black hair, one small with yellow pigtails, and one medium with yellow hair labeled Miss Heather. "Daddy says we need to be extra careful right now, but I missed you," Penny explained, climbing onto Heather's lap with the uninhibited trust of childhood. "I brought Penguin too. He gets scared when there are bad guys around." Watching his daughter curl trustingly against Heather, Richard felt something shift inside him, a space long frozen beginning to thaw, despite his efforts to maintain emotional distance. The 3 of them formed a tableau he'd never imagined possible after Catherine's death. "If I still love Mommy in heaven but also like Miss Heather here, is that bad?" Penny asked later that night as Richard tucked her into the guest bedroom prepared for her visit. The innocent question knocked the breath from his lungs more effectively than any physical blow. Dr. Marshall arrived in Pittsburgh under heavy guard 3 days later, his once confident demeanor replaced by the haunted look of a man who had fled but couldn't escape his conscience. His hands trembled visibly as Frank escorted him into the warehouse's secure conference room. "I never wanted to harm her," were his first words to Richard, spoken with the desperation of someone who had rehearsed justifications during sleepless nights. "They threatened my family, showed me photos of my children at school, my wife at her yoga studio." Richard remained perfectly still, his control absolute despite the rage coursing beneath his composed exterior. "Yet you altered her medication, approved experimental treatments her body wasn't strong enough to handle, and falsified her final records." The confession, once started, poured from Marshall like a dam breaking. Details of Paul's initial approach 3 years earlier, the gradual escalation from minor ethics violations to active participation in hastening Catherine's decline, and finally, the network of Cortese family connections that had infiltrated Richard's organization while he was distracted by personal grief. "Sign this," Richard instructed, sliding a notarized affidavit across the table, detailing everything Marshall had just revealed. "Then you'll be escorted to the FBI field office, where an agent who owes me a favor is expecting your voluntary surrender." Heather watched this exchange from the doorway, medical files clutched to her chest as evidence to supplement Marshall's testimony. "The statute of limitations hasn't expired for medical malpractice resulting in death," she added, her professional knowledge adding weight to Richard's implied threat. With Marshall secured in federal custody and Sanders under surveillance by Richard's loyal men, the final pieces of their strategy fell into place. Evidence packages were prepared for delivery to 3 separate destinations: the FBI, the district attorney's office, and a trusted journalist at the Pittsburgh Tribune. "Paul will be expecting us to move against him directly," Richard explained to Heather as they finalized preparations in the warehouse. "He doesn't understand that Catherine taught me the value of working within the system when possible. The legitimate authorities will do our work for us." Early the following morning, simultaneous raids struck across Pittsburgh, federal agents swarming Paul's lakeside mansion, local police executing search warrants at his downtown offices, and Interpol representatives freezing accounts in 3 different countries. Richard watched the news coverage from the warehouse, his expression unreadable as cameras captured Paul being escorted to a waiting police vehicle. 2 years, he murmured, his voice barely audible. 2 years she's been gone while he walked free, building his power at my expense. Heather stood beside him, close enough to offer support without intruding on his moment of vindication. "Catherine would be proud of how you handled this, choosing justice over vengeance, protecting Penny from the fallout, building a case that will stand in court." The warehouse's industrial silence was broken by the soft ping of Heather's phone, a message from her former supervisor at the nursing home checking on her unexpected leave of absence. This small reminder of her regular life felt surreal against the backdrop of federal raids and criminal conspiracies that had become her daily reality. "There will be questions about your involvement when this becomes public," Richard said, his tactical mind already working through the aftermath. "I've arranged for legal representation and prepared a statement that protects your reputation while acknowledging your role in bringing Catherine's case to light." Outside, a light rain began to fall on Pittsburgh's steel-gray rivers, the water carrying reflections of city lights that blurred and reformed with each droplet, much like the identities they had both navigated during these weeks together, neither fully who they were before, nor entirely transformed. The media frenzy surrounding Paul's arrest dominated Pittsburgh news cycles for days, with headlines proclaiming, Corporate conspiracy led to socialite's death, and medical murder plot uncovered. Through it all, Richard's name remained conspicuously absent, the work of strategic influence and carefully cultivated relationships with key officials. The Cortese family is retreating from Pittsburgh, Frank reported a week after the arrests began. Their leadership understands this wasn't an attack on their territory, just justice for Catherine. They're respecting the distinction. Richard nodded, satisfaction evident in his relaxed posture as he sat beside Penny in the mansion's garden, watching her feed the koi in Catherine's pond. And our legitimate businesses. Has the publicity affected operations? Stock prices actually rose after the announcement of Paul's arrest, Frank replied with a small smile. The board is impressed with how cleanly you excised the corruption. They're voting tomorrow on your proposal to expand the charitable foundation in Catherine's name. As security concerns diminished, Heather prepared to return to her apartment and resume her nursing duties, packing the few belongings that had migrated to the warehouse during her weeks under Richard's protection. The prospect of returning to her solitary life felt strangely hollow after the intensity of recent events. Penny's asking when you'll visit next, Richard said from the doorway of the warehouse bedroom, his casual stance belied by the intensity in his dark eyes. She's become quite attached to you. We both have. Autumn gave way to winter. Pittsburgh's hills and valleys transformed by the season's first snowfall into a landscape of pristine white that concealed the city's industrial edges. Heather stood at her apartment window, watching fat snowflakes drift past the glass, while contemplating the invitation card in her hand. The Castellini family request your presence at the dedication of the Catherine Castellini Memorial Wing at Mercy Hospital, read the elegant script, followed by details of the ceremony scheduled for the following weekend. The formal invitation was accompanied by a handwritten note in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Penny and I would be honored by your attendance. The hospital's main lobby had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with Catherine's favorite winter roses and photographs chronicling her life of philanthropy before illness claimed her. Healthcare professionals mingled with Pittsburgh's elite, unified by the common purpose of celebrating a life that had touched many. You look beautiful, Richard whispered as he approached Heather, his genuine appreciation for her simple blue dress warming her cheeks despite the December chill seeping through the hospital's massive windows. Catherine would have approved of your choice. She always said that color brought out your eyes. Penny danced between them, resplendent in a party dress and clearly enjoying her role as unofficial hostess. Miss Heather, Daddy says you might come live with us soon. Is that true? Could you read me stories every night like Mommy used to? Richard's eyes widened at his daughter's innocent disclosure of conversations not meant for public revelation. Penny, remember what we discussed about some things being private? He gently reminded her, though the affectionate exasperation in his tone contained no real reproach. The dedication ceremony proceeded with dignified simplicity, Richard's speech focusing on Catherine's passion for ensuring quality health care for all Pittsburgh residents, regardless of financial status. The new wing would provide specialized oncology treatment for patients without insurance, funded in perpetuity by the Castellini Foundation. This isn't just about honoring her memory, Richard concluded, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. It's about continuing her work, transforming pain into purpose, and ensuring that other families have resources we lacked during her battle. As applause filled the atrium, Heather felt a small hand slip into hers, Penny standing beside her with complete trust, forming a connection that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting. The child's innocent acceptance had bridged worlds that might otherwise never have intersected. Later that evening, as guests mingled during the reception, Richard guided Heather to a quiet corner of the garden atrium, where Catherine's favorite orchids bloomed, despite the snow piling against windows outside. "There's something I've been wanting to show you," he said, withdrawing an envelope from his inner pocket. Inside lay a photograph Heather had never seen, Catherine sitting up in her hospital bed, smiling despite obvious pain, with a younger Heather visible in the background adjusting an IV pump. "She mentioned you in her journal almost every day during those final months," Richard explained softly. "The kind nurse with sad eyes who deserves her own happiness someday." He read from a small leather-bound journal, Catherine's handwriting gracing the pages he turned with reverent care. "She reminds me of myself before I met Richard, dedicated to helping others while forgetting to live her own life." Heather blinked back unexpected tears, touched by Catherine's perception, and the strange twist of fate that had brought her into the orbit of the family her former patient had loved so fiercely. She was remarkably perceptive, even when suffering, Most patients turn inward, but she remained connected to everyone around her. Richard closed the journal carefully, his next words chosen with deliberate precision. Catherine's last entry mentioned you specifically, said if anything happened to her, she hoped you might help remind me that life continues even after devastating loss. It seems she saw possibilities I wasn't ready to imagine. A distant piano began playing somewhere in the reception hall, the familiar notes of Catherine's favorite Chopin nocturne drifting through the atrium. She requested this piece for Penny's dance recitals, Richard explained, the music bridging past and present as smoothly as the melting snow outside transformed winter into promise of spring. Heather recognized the melody from hospital nights, when Catherine, unable to sleep through pain, would hum it softly while describing the ballet classes she hoped Penny would continue, even after she was gone. The memory crystallized the extraordinary connection between these three lives, one departed but still guiding, two present but still finding their way forward. I kept my nursing license current, Heather said unexpectedly, her professional commitment suddenly relevant to personal possibilities. The Foundation's new oncology wing will need experienced staff who understand both medical protocols and the emotional landscape patients navigate. Someone who remembers to treat the person, not just the disease. Snow continued falling beyond the glass walls of the atrium, creating a peaceful backdrop as Pittsburgh's lights twinkled through the winter night. Penny adores you, Richard continued, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. And I found myself looking forward to your visits more than I thought possible after Catherine. Are you certain? Heather asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate conversation. Your world is complex, dangerous at times. My life has always been simple by comparison. Early shifts and comfortable routines. Richard's smile held a warmth few people ever witnessed, the private expression of a man accustomed to hiding his true self from the world. Catherine once told me that complicated men need the balance of straightforward women. She would have approved of how directly you challenge my assumptions. The dedication reception continued around them, but they remained in their quiet corner, discussing possibilities neither had anticipated when they first met in Frick Park months earlier. No definitive decisions were made that evening, yet something had shifted. Permission granted by Catherine's own words to explore connections that honored, rather than diminished her memory. Spring arrived in Pittsburgh with characteristic unpredictability, snow giving way to delicate blossoms almost overnight as the city emerged from winter's grip. The three of them, Richard, Penny, and Heather, stood at Catherine's graveside, placing fresh flowers beside the elegant headstone that marked her final resting place. Mommy would be happy we're all together, Penny declared with childish certainty, her hand firmly clasped in Heather's as butterflies danced among nearby flowering bushes. I told her all about you when Daddy wasn't listening. Richard knelt beside his daughter, straightening the colorful drawings she had propped against the stone. What exactly did you tell her? He asked gently, his tone suggesting this was a familiar conversation, rather than a disturbing one. That Miss Heather makes you smile again, Penny replied simply, the truth of childhood cutting through adult complexities. And that her heart has lots of rooms too. One for her patients, one for me, one for you. And still plenty of room for Mommy too. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, as your support is important for me to continue creating content here.